Welcome back to your Mortgage Minute by onlendhub.ca. Today we are talking to every Canadian who has turned their condo, basement, or cottage into an Airbnb or other short-term rental. New tax rules and stricter lending standards in 2026 are squeezing hosts from both sides, cash flow and financing. What is actually changing? And how do you decide whether to keep, convert, or sell one of these properties before your next renewal? We have our mortgage expert, Mouli, here on the show. Mouli, can you start with what has shifted in the last year that makes 2026 so different for short-term rental owners?
Two big shifts landed almost at the same time. First, the Income Tax Act changes that took effect from 2024 now deny expense deductions like mortgage interest, property taxes, and utilities for non-compliant short-term rentals that do not meet local licensing or zoning rules. Second, lenders are tightening how they finance short-term rentals, typically capping loan to value at about 75% and using conservative rental offsets or even long-term market rent instead of your peak Airbnb income to qualify the mortgage. Put together, that means a property that looked fantastic on a spreadsheet in 2022 might now be cash flow negative after tax and harder to refinance.
Let us quantify that. Take a simple example. A Toronto condo you bought for investment, now used mainly as an Airbnb. Walk us through the numbers on, say, a $600,000 property with a short-term rental mortgage, and what changes when those expenses become non-deductible because the unit is not fully compliant.
Sure, let us assume you have a $450,000 mortgage at a 5.5% rate with a 25-year amortization. The monthly payment is roughly $2,750. Add $600 a month for condo fees, $300 for property tax, and $350 for utilities, cleaning, and platform fees, and your all-in monthly cost is about $4,000. If your Airbnb revenue averages $4,300 a month, your pre-tax cash flow is $300 positive. Under the old rules, you could deduct almost that full $4,000 of expenses against the rental income, so you were only taxed on the $300. Under the new rules, if your unit is non-compliant with local bylaws, a big chunk of those expenses becomes non-deductible, so you might be taxed on the full $4,300 of income, turning what looked like a small profit into a meaningful after-tax loss.
So that $300 win can quietly become a few $100s of after-tax pain each month if you ignore compliance. What about the lending side? When that same investor goes to refinance in 2026, how do lenders actually underwrite this, and where do you see people getting surprised?
Most A lenders in Canada do not underwrite based on your best Airbnb months. They typically either use long-term market rent or apply a conservative rental offset, like 50 to 80% of expected rent, to your income when they calculate your gross debt service and total debt service ratios. On specialized short-term rental products, you are usually limited to 75% loan to value, which means you need a 25% down payment or equivalent equity to refinance. A red flag I am seeing is deals that only work if you assume very high nightly rates and 90% occupancy. If a lender instead underwrites using, say, $2,200 a month of long-term rent with a 50% offset, the debt service math can fail completely. If the property only works as a short-term rental on paper, that is a warning sign, not a business model.
Let us build a second example around that underwriting. Say someone wants to buy a cottage they hope to Airbnb part-time. Market long-term rent might be $2,200 a month. If the lender only uses half of that in the numbers, what does the debt service picture look like on, say, a $500,000 mortgage?
On a $500,000 mortgage at 5.5% over 25 years, the payment is about $3,050 a month. If the lender uses long-term market rent of $2,200 with a 50% offset, only $1,100 counts towards servicing that debt. So from the lender's perspective, your other income has to comfortably cover roughly $1,950 of payment, plus your other debts and housing costs. If your salary and other obligations already push your total debt service close to the 40 to 44% range, this purchase will likely be declined, even if your own projections show $4,000 a month of Airbnb revenue. The strategic takeaway is simple. Always run the deal as if it were a plain long-term rental first. If it fails there, you are speculating on occupancy and regulations, not investing.
You mentioned strategy, and I want to turn this into a framework. For someone who already owns one or two short-term rentals in the GTA or a vacation market and has a renewal coming up, how do they decide whether to keep the property and adjust, convert it to long-term, or sell outright?
Think of it as a three-step decision framework. Step one is compliance and tax. Confirm that your property is fully licensed and zoned for short-term rentals in your municipality, and talk to your tax professional to verify that your mortgage interest and other expenses remain deductible under the new rules. If you cannot get compliant, you are effectively running a business where a major cost line, your mortgage, is no longer tax efficient, which is usually not sustainable. Step two is lender reality. Get a renewal or refinance projection that uses conservative long-term rent and the actual policies of your likely lender, including any 75% loan-to-value cap. Step three is portfolio roll. Ask whether this property strengthens your overall balance sheet with decent cash flow and reasonable leverage, or whether it is the weakest link. If it is the weakest link, it is a candidate to convert to long-term rent or to sell to de-risk the rest of your portfolio.
Give me one more numbers example where conversion to long-term saves the deal. Maybe a situation where someone is barely breaking even on Airbnb after tax, but switching to a standard lease plus a different mortgage structure actually makes the lender and the numbers happier.
Take a small Milton townhouse worth $750,000 with a $560,000 mortgage at 5.3%. The monthly payment is about $3,350. As a short-term rental, suppose you are grossing $4,200 a month but spending $1,100 on cleaning, supplies, and platform fees, plus $350 on utilities. All in, you are at about $4,800 of monthly costs, which means $600 negative cash flow before tax. After tax, with some expenses potentially disallowed if you are not fully compliant, the bleed could be closer to $900 a month. If you switch to a long-term tenant at $3,100 a month, drop most of the variable costs, and lock into a slightly lower rate through a standard insured or insurable structure, your all-in monthly cost might fall to around $3,800, leaving a $700 gap that is still negative but far more manageable and easier to underwrite. In many cases, combining long-term rent, a small lump sum prepayment at renewal, and an extended amortization can pull that gap close to break even.
I want to surface a clear red flag before we wrap. What is one pattern you see with short-term rental owners that almost always leads to trouble if they do not address it quickly?
The biggest red flag is relying on 100% of your past Airbnb revenue to justify both your tax position and your financing. If your pro forma only works when every month looks like August, you are building on sand. Lenders, especially in 2026, generally underwrite based on long-term rent or conservative offsets, not your highest nightly rate. And the tax rules are now unforgiving if you are not compliant with municipal bylaws. A safer approach is to stress test every short-term rental at long-term rent, assume some vacancy, and make sure you can still carry the mortgage comfortably on your personal income plus that conservative rent. If the numbers break under that scenario, you either need more equity, a different property, or a different strategy.
Let us land this with 3 quick takeaways for listeners who own or are considering short-term rentals. First, compliance is non-negotiable now. If your unit does not meet local licensing and zoning rules, your tax deductions can evaporate and your after-tax cash flow can flip negative overnight. Second, underwrite every deal using long-term market rent and conservative rental offsets, not your best Airbnb month. Third, use your next renewal as a checkpoint. Be willing to convert to long-term rental or even sell the weakest property to protect your overall portfolio. This has been your Mortgage Minute by onlendhub.ca. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.